session all focused on why your AI agents or models are blind and what you can do to make them see more effectively. What's the direction of AI going today? Well, first things first, agentic applications, right? I think we're seeing this everywhere, where every tool, every widget, every platform has some sort of autonomous or largely agentic process built into it. I think we've seen a lot more of them come out into the space, and even more plug in those features, right? That becomes even more effective when you start talking about documentation and unstructured data, people wanting to take the data they've been housing and storing in warehouses for decades and start to plug those into models to use more effectively. However, if you take these agentic layers that operate on siloed system and you take this data that's largely non-cohesive, albeit somewhat valuable, we need to start developing data as context, right? How do we take both the structured and the unstructured data, put it together in a meaningful way so that it can be consumed by these agentic applications effectively to produce more accurate results? As I'm certain all of you guys see in your individual orgs today, there is a wide problem where the AI applications you have are going to vary in responses, usefulness, and value, depending on who asks those questions and in what prompt with what data backbone. So with this in mind, right, the strategy you're using for AI today, or the one that you might be planning, with these things in mind, is already dead. It's already not going to work. It's behind and operating off stale information. The piece that does hold true is that if you have data warehouses, you have data lakes, or even composite other data lakes owned by various teams, that is not a data strategy, right? You are going to end up with silos, you're going to end up with vacuums, and you're going to have agentic applications, agents or otherwise, operating only off a subset of data. When you do it this way, you are creating a lot of duplicative spend, a lot of duplicative work. Changes and fixes are reactive. And what was intentionally designed to help give support and breadth to your data and IT teams, you've created duplicative work that creates an even bigger backlog for them to work with. So no, having a data warehouse where you just plug data into and that gets replicated across the org as silos is not a data strategy. It is also not a data strategy to simply try and hook those pieces together, right? Because you're still not going to have that context. You're not going to have that core layer to plug in and put them on top of each other, right? Having data simply moving in any form or fashion without a centralization model on top of it is going to still create silos and create duplicative work. So no, integration's still not going to solve that problem. If we take this in context, we take integration and warehouses and kind of put them together, you might end up with something like this, the typical data stack, right? Where if you take the left side, you have that information around data being entered into various systems, CRMs, ERPs, warehouses, otherwise. You have chat support information, so what people might be doing in your web content. And then, of course, you have those documentations, which we talked about as well, PDFs, CSVs, otherwise. This is then ETL'd or iPassed into a data warehouse. You might have some transformation to move it into a analytics warehouse, like a Snowflake or Databricks or something of that nature, where you can then run your BI tool or even put some of that information reverse ETL back into your various sources. A linear process historically runs, right? But if you then start to take the AI that goes in your applications, right, these edge AI agents, you start having AI chatbots or AI-based support inside of those chat systems, or ultimately things like Google Vision or OCR that tries to process and parse through that documentation and running through onto these actual data sets, right? You're then going to have your various agents running on top of both warehouses back in those different applications, all operating in vacuums without any centralization, right? Thus creating all sorts of duplicative work. This is historically what people start to go after, plugging AI on just small pieces of that journey. But as you can kind of see on the right here, what this doesn't account for are things like governance, observability, actual system integration, and freshness and quality of the data. And this is meaningful because if you have a single agent operating on silos of your data, you are only going to get partial and half truths. You're going to have people who might not have access or the correct control of this information to get things that they don't need or should not have access to. You're not able to control for freshness or quality. And so the data that people might be operating on could be stale. And what you're going to end up with is outdated or ineffective results. Thus, you're spending a lot of time, money, and effort on something that doesn't produce any actual value. This holds true if you think of the big reports by people like Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, who talks about the actual return on investment on AI for a lot of these different companies, whether starting or those who consume, has not been seen yet in the past couple of years, right? And that is because the foundation is bad. We've all talked about the garbage in, garbage out. So if we take this, what do we do? What is our process? Well, is it traditional data management, right? These have been around forever. We are seeing a renaissance in that space, but I still don't believe that is the case, right? One, they're archaic. Like I mentioned, they're 20 years old. If they were the solution, we would have solved this and we wouldn't be having this conversation today. They're also a nightmare to implement. If you've ever tried working with a data management structure, it's usually multiple years, multiple teams of consultants and technologies, and it's really often pretty hard to assign any value that has come out of that. Not to mention, it's time consuming, right? A multi-year process, and by the time you get to the end, does that even line up with what you originally have set up to solve? 3-4 years later, as you enter the end of that process stack, are you happy with results? Is it kept up to time? This matters a lot more now than it ever did, because if you think of how different the world was 2 years ago in terms of automation and AI, we'd be looking at a radically different space than we are today. So the project you started 2 years ago is already radically out of date. So what do we do? Well, we can talk about what we do at Synchrony, or even the process that we're trying to solve, which is creating that agentic core where you have a centralized layer for all of these processes. All the data that comes in from warehouses, lakes, documentation, applications, and otherwise gets parsed through and mastered in a traditional sense, right? That part remains the same. But rather than existing only in that warehouse and going through the traditional approach we talked about before, moving from warehouse to warehouse, that becomes the central context for all of your analytics reports, all of your automations and agentic workflows you're running at that point, and ultimately the MCP layer that goes back into those applications. The core issue with these different agents is they don't have access to your entire subset of data because those data live in vacuums and different silos. But if you offer a layer where every agent you have, people who run their individual models, subscriptions of ChatGPT or Claude or otherwise, can access that data, and that data is governed, controlled, and kept fresh by the process and management structure you've put on that agentic core, you're not always going to get the same response. That's the nature of generative LLMs or agents, but you're going to be operating on that same data set. You know that you're going to be in the same ballpark the entire time. Now, of course, you can build this, right? I don't want to suggest that you can't and that Synchrony is the only option, right? If you do decide to build it, I encourage you to think of a centralization approach and work on it in that sense, rather than operate a traditional vacuum of silos and make the same mistakes everyone else has been making for the past year. But you can also talk to us, right? We're doing this out in the wild. If we talk about one customer I worked with was all about trying to build a better customer experience, right? They have this data flowing into that agentic core where they have things like their ticket data, their customer profiling, what's happening with the product, and ultimately all of the reporting off that central layer, right? So what we were designed to do was go down and start to build auto trigger based workflows, try to create flags and automations when people start to have issues, rather than wait for somebody to talk to them and file a ticket after they've been upset for a couple of weeks. And depending on what they solve, what they go after, start recommending new paths to get higher adoption. So what was the output? Well, we saw that in their current customer base, they saw a 40% plus feature adoption. So they saw more people starting to use that information, this piece of the product. Beyond that, it made it stickier. So an additional 25% of their customer base decided to retain and stay on top of that. Not to mention, they saw a decline in tickets by more than half, right? Reducing that IT backlog because we got ahead of the problem. We solved it with agentic processing on that centralized layer rather than operating in individualized vacuums, right? This goes back to my point earlier, where if we don't leave everything in silos, we create that unified data foundation where you have access to that centralized profile, regardless of domains, regardless of source. You can build a stronger truth for your AI to run more effectively. You're not operating on data that is only partially true. Broadly speaking, we also see people doing more smaller pieces. That undertaking was quite large, right? We're looking at a large data set, multiple systems, multiple processes. But you can also do something a bit more narrow, right? You can do single-threaded automations off of a smaller subset of data that expands over time, right? If you want to do chat monitoring or forum monitoring, understanding and protecting your brand because you can parse through and monitor what might be painful or incorrect or offensive to your model, and you can correct that or start to solve those kinds of problems. We see a lot of people do scoring and routing processes that are agentic, updating those kinds of pieces and trying to solve for the issues on what's going on with their data in those kinds of models. Ultimately, if we also talk about trying to comply and keep up to date with regulations and processes, you can automate those steps as well because you have the full cycle of that data and that information that exists inside of that agentic core. So what I want you to gather as we kind of wrap up and enter hopefully a question cycle here is, yes, this is what we're doing at Synchrony, the first agentic data management platform. But if you are going to build and enhance your AI strategy, or even start to go down this path, right? Please don't do what the industry's decided is standard, which is have your data sources flow into a warehouse, ETL it to an analytics warehouse, and put agents on individual pieces. Build a centralized layer where you have that data running at all times. It's kept up to date and you're managing it in that sense. And you're running your agents all off that same centralized layer and exposing it to the necessary parties. If you run it that way, you'll at least get similar answers and you're going to get similar responses off a centralized core piece of data rather than have everything operate in a vacuum. Of course, alternatively, you can also talk to us at Synchrony. We'd be happy to help set that up or at least guide you down that right path. And hopefully you found this helpful. So thank you so much.